The courtroom was stifling, not from heat, not from noise, but from the sheer weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone inside. Every seat was filled. Every breath was held. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to happen. At the defense table, Lucas Hayes sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The weight of months in a cold, gray cell had etched itself onto his face, deep lines of exhaustion, grief, and quiet resignation. The suit he wore hung loose on him, his frame having withered under the crushing burden of being labeled a murderer. Across the room, Daniel Grayson, the prosecutor, stood tall and confident. His voice was sharp, unwavering. "Your Honor," he declared, slamming a thick folder onto the table. "The evidence is irrefutable. The only person responsible for Emily Hayes' murder is her husband, Lucas Hayes." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the large screen behind him flickered to life. Crime scene photos appeared, dark red stains smeared across bedroom walls, a broken lamp lying in the corner, a bloodied bedsheet that once held the warmth of a living, breathing woman. The jury flinched. A few gasps escaped. Then came the messages. The final desperate texts Emily had sent before her death. "He's not himself anymore. I'm scared. I don't know what to do." A woman in the back wiped away a tear. Journalists scribbled furiously, pens shaking. Lucas barely moved. His chest rose and fell in slow, heavy breaths. He had long since given up screaming his innocence. At the judge's bench, Margaret Holloway adjusted her glasses, her face unreadable. She was the only one in the room who remained still, calm, poised, yet holding the power to decide a man's fate with a single strike of her gavel. She looked down at Lucas, her voice measured, deliberate. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone giving away nothing. "The jury has reached a verdict. Do you have any final words before I hand down your sentence?" Silence. Lucas lifted his head. Once, his eyes had held hope. Now, they were empty. Hollow. He inhaled, opened his mouth to speak. "Stop the trial. Hes innocent." The courtroom froze. A shockwave rippled through the room as every head whipped around to see where the voice had come from. Gasps erupted. Reporters scrambled, cameras clicking. Standing in the middle of the stunned crowd was a 13-year-old boy, fists clenched, his dark brown eyes burning with conviction. Ethan Reynolds. The judge's expression hardened. "Bailiff, remove that child immediately." The guards moved in, but Ethan stood his ground. "You have to listen to me," he shouted. "If you don't, an innocent man will go to prison for the rest of his life." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Jury members whispered. Spectators murmured. At the defense table, Lucas Hayes stared at Ethan, his mouth slightly open. It was the look of a man who had just seen a ghost. Before anyone could react further, Judge Holloway's gavel came crashing down. "Order in the court." The noise died instantly. She turned sharply to the bailiffs. "Take the boy to my chambers. We will deal with this privately." Ethan was seized by the arms and escorted toward the door. But before disappearing behind the heavy wooden frame, he turned back one last time. His gaze locked with Lucas Hayes. And in that moment, Lucas knew, this boy knew something no one else did. The night air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp asphalt, and the lingering heat of the day. Streetlights flickered, their dim glow casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the soft hum of crickets, a quiet that made everything feel eerily still. Ethan Reynolds pedaled through Greenwood Park, his legs burning from the late-night ride. He wasn't supposed to be out this late. His mom would have grounded him for a month if she knew. But there was something about riding alone at night, the wind against his face, the world stretching out in front of him, empty and free. Then he heard it. A voice. Sharp. Urgent. Ethan hit the brakes, his bike skidding slightly, gravel crunching beneath the tires. His chest tightened as he scanned the dimly lit parking lot just ahead. At first, nothing seemed out of place, just rows of parked cars, sitting lifeless beneath the fluorescent streetlights. Silent. Still. Then movement. Two figures stood near a black SUV, their bodies tense, locked in an exchange Ethan couldn't hear. A woman with blonde hair, her stance rigid, hands raised as if pleading. The man in front of her stood firm, his fists clenched at his sides. Even from a distance, Ethan could feel it. Something was wrong. The woman shook her head, stepping back. The man lunged forward. His grip latched onto her wrist, not gently, not desperately, but forcefully. She yanked her arm back, her voice rising in panic. "Let me go." Ethan's fingers tightened around the handlebars. Every instinct screamed at him to look away, to mind his own business, to just keep riding. But his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, watching from behind the shadows of a nearby tree, breath caught in his throat. The man's head snapped left, then right, searching for witnesses. For a terrifying moment, Ethan thought their eyes met. A bolt of fear shot through him, locking him in place. But before he could react, the man yanked the woman toward the SUV. She struggled, her feet scraping against the ground, fingers clawing at the car door as he forced it open. Her voice cracked with desperation, but the parking lot swallowed her words. Ethan wanted to yell, wanted to do something. Anything. But he was just a kid. One final shove and she disappeared inside. Slam. The car door shut, sealing her fate. The man stood still for a second, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then, without hesitation, he rounded the front of the vehicle, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Headlights flared to life, casting sharp beams across the pavement. And then screeching tires, the roar of an engine, the black SUV sped off into the night. Just like that, they were gone. Ethan sat motionless, his grip on the handlebars unyielding. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. His stomach churned. What had he just witnessed? A misunderstanding? A couple fighting? Or something far, far worse? The unease settled deep in his chest, refusing to leave. But he told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself it didn't matter. A memory that wouldn't fade weeks past. The memory of that night clung to Ethan like a shadow, creeping into his thoughts when he least expected it. He tried to forget, tried to shake the sickening feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then, one morning, the news broke. Emily Hayes found dead. Ethan sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the newspaper his mom had left behind. His cereal sat untouched, turning soggy in the bowl. His fingers trembled as they gripped the paper's edges. His eyes locked onto the front page headline. Husband charged in WIFES murder. Beneath the bold, damning words was a photograph of Emily Hayes, a smiling woman with deep brown eyes. Her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders. Ethan's breath caught. His pulse pounded in his ears. Dark hair. Not blonde. His mind raced back to that night. The woman he had seen struggling in the parking lot. The one who had fought against the man, who had been shoved into the black SUV. She had blonde hair, his stomach twisted. If Emily Hayes had dark hair, then who was the woman in that car? Ethan's hands trembled as he scrolled through the news article on his tablet, scanning for any mention of a second woman. Nothing. The report painted a simple, airtight story. Emily Hayes had been found dead. Lucas Hayes, her husband, was the only suspect. The police had their evidence, and the case was already being called open and shut. But Ethan knew better. There was someone else, someone no one was talking about. The man in the parking lot. The one who had looked over his shoulder, scanning the area. The one who had checked to see if anyone was watching. Ethan had seen him. And now, an innocent man was about to go to prison for the rest of his life. His heart pounded harder. He had convinced himself that what he saw that night didn't matter. But he was wrong. It mattered more than anything. And if he stayed silent, the truth would never come out. A murderer would walk free. And someone somewhere might still be out there, waiting to be saved. Ethan sat stiffly in Judge Holloway's chambers, his hands balled into fists on his lap. The room felt far too big, its walls lined with heavy bookshelves, the air thick with something heavier than silenced doubt. Across from him, Daniel Grayson, the prosecutor, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You're telling me," Grayson said, voice dripping with skepticism, "that you, a 13-year-old, somehow know more about this case than the police, the forensic team, and an entire jury of adults?" Ethan opened his mouth, but Grayson waved a dismissive hand. "This is a courtroom, kid, not a playground." His voice was colder now. "You don't get to just burst in here and yell stop the trial like this is some detective movie. The real world doesn't work that way." Ethan's stomach twisted, But he held his ground. "I know what I saw," he said, his voice steady. "And it wasn't Emily Hayes in that car." Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is absurd," he muttered, turning toward Judge Holloway. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. His testimony isn't evidence. It's a story, that's all it is." That's all they thought, this was a story. Ethan clenched his fists tighter. He turned to Victor Martinez, Lucas Hayes' defense attorney. Unlike Grayson, Martinez wasn't brushing him off. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even blinking. He was watching. Studying. "If what you're saying is true," Martinez finally said, his voice measured, "then we have a serious problem. But a contradiction in hair color isn't enough." He leaned forward, eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You understand that, right?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I get it." Before Martinez could respond, the door burst open. Sarah Reynolds, his mother. She rushed inside, her face pale with fear, breath coming in short gasps. "Ethan," she said, grabbing his shoulder, her fingers digging in. "What are you doing?" "Mom, I had to say something," Ethan insisted. "They're sending the wrong man to prison." Sarah turned to the judge, then to the lawyers, her voice frantic. "He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's scared. He's confused." "I'm not confused," Ethan shouted. "I saw her, Mom. The woman in that car. She wasn't Emily Hayes." Sarah's grip on him tightened. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." The room went still. Martinez sighed. He turned to Judge Holloway. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like time to investigate this claim. If there's even a chance this boy is telling the truth." "Absolutely not," Grayson cut in. "We're not derailing an entire case because a kid thinks he saw something months ago. This trial is built on solid evidence. Then what's the harm in verifying it?" Martinez countered. "The harm is that we're wasting time and resources chasing after a child's imagination," Grayson snapped. Sarah turned to Martinez now, desperation in her eyes. "Please," she pleaded. "Just tell him to stop. He's my son. I don't want him caught up in something dangerous." Martinez hesitated. Ethan's heart pounded. This was it. The moment someone had to believe him. Finally, Martinez exhaled. "I won't dismiss this until I look into it further," he said. But his gaze hardened. "Ethan, words alone won't save a man's life. Bring me proof." A warning, and a decision that night. Something felt off. Not in the way a bad dream lingers when you wake up. Not in the way a storm makes the walls creak. This was different. It was real. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. No one believed him. Not Grayson. Not his mom. Not even Martinez, not really. They thought he was just a kid who had seen something and twisted it into a story. They were wrong. And someone out there knew it. A noise. Soft. Barely there. Ethan tensed. It came from outside. Slowly, he pushed back his covers and sat up, every nerve in his body on edge. He moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. The street was quiet. Their house sat on the corner, the street light flickering every few seconds, casting long, jittery shadows along the pavement. Everything looked normal. Then movement. Beyond the hedge at the edge of their yard, a figure stood. Just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to send a cold chill down Ethan's spine. His breath caught. Was it just someone passing through? A neighbor walking their dog? Or was it something else? Someone watching. His fingers curled around the curtain. He should wake his mom. He should. Then his phone buzzed. The sound made him jump. His heart pounded as he reached for it, flipping it over in his hands.